On June 3 this year, the Centre's first chairman, Neville Kennard, died after a battle with melanoma. Nev was a highly successful businessman and a classic entrepreneur. I first met him in 1975, and in 1976, as I was thinking about starting what is now the CIS, he was one of the first people I wrote to about my plans and asked if he would support the Centre. He did. Along with a few others, and with it came his typical encouragement of new ideas. Nev was a real libertarian, and an organisation dedicated to the intellectual pursuit of freedom appealed to him greatly. When we were incorporated in 1977, we're talking about a long time ago now, isn't it? We needed a board, and Nev was an enthusiastic foundation member and became its first chairman. Those were the days when it was a part-time outfit, and I was still a high school teacher. Having someone like Nev as a mentor and advisor, not to mention a friend, to this little neophyte like me, who had absolutely no idea about running a business of any sort, but did have some good ideas, which of course Nev supported. When we went full-time in 1979, Nev made it possible for me to take leave without pay from my teaching job and not be without some income, and as I tried to work at getting support. By the end of the year, we did finally get sufficient support, and I resigned from my position at Richmond High School. Nev remained as chairman for over 8 years and passed on the baton to Maurice Newman. Then we remained on the board for several years more. Importantly, for the long-term future and development of the CIS, he remained a good supporter all these years, and we all owe him a great debt for being willing to back this idea for so long. In fact, I just don't think it would have been possible if I didn't have someone like him behind me, urging me on, also nagging at me for all sorts of reasons. And for those people who knew him, you know what a nagger he was. CIS owes so much to Neville Kennard. The board of the Centre thought it appropriate that we honour his contribution to CIS in some way. And after discussions with his son Sam, and Sam is here with us tonight, brother Andy and his wife Gabby, we suggested that we should name either the opening or closing dinner address at Consilium the Neville Kennard address. They all thought it was a fitting way for him to be remembered in an enduring way. So tonight we'll be hearing from the inaugural Neville Kennard address, and we are delighted to have Bjorn Lomborg here to be the first speaker. But before we move on to Bjorn, I'd like to invite Sam up just to say a few words.
Thanks, Greg. I won't take a lot of time. I know there's been a lot of talking. Just a bit about me, just 3 bullet points. I'm Nev's oldest son of three boys. I'm the managing director of Kennard Self Storage, and I was thrown in the deep end by my dad in 1995 when I was 25 to take on that role, so it's been 17 years. And I'm a multi-generational libertarian. It's an honour to be here to do this, albeit a bit heavy. Since my dad passed away, I've been overwhelmed, our whole family's been overwhelmed with the tributes, the emails, phone calls, letters, cards, and all the way. This video has been made, online tributes. It's been really touching and quite amazing. And I thought I knew him, and I thought I knew how widely he impacted people, but I didn't really get it until I saw all those things coming in. And people who owe careers, businesses, he was a very open and sharing man and gave a lot of people a great start. Many people, even competing businesses, he would open the business up and show them how they did things, and they were rewarded. And they've actually been quite generous to some of the causes since he died. I think the CIS has benefited from some big donations, and so has Stepping Stone House, is where we want to direct some of the money for people who want to do that sort of thing. He's really entrepreneurial, innovative, curious, inquisitive and thoughtful. And nagging. I'm going to get to that bit. He was passionate about liberty, free enterprise, free markets, property rights and self-ownership. He also believed that the combination of democracy and the welfare state wasn't that good. He and Greg came together, 95, 96 and 76? 75, 76. And Greg added a lot of colour to that time, more than I know. I was pretty young. But he was great at startups. One thing he was really good at with business was starting an enterprise. And I think It was really fortunate for the CIS and Greg, because Nev's ability to pull things together and get traction around an idea happened a lot of ways in business, and his passion for liberty was a great combination for the CIS and instrumental in shaping it. He was also provocative and disruptive. I know that. I worked with him, and he sort of thought when things got a bit comfortable, it was time to change. So he would agitate for change. And I know that he laid out some challenging ideas and views for the CIS. And despite his occasional bluntness, his intentions were always good. So on behalf of my family, I'd like to thank the CIS for remembering him and his contribution to this initiative for all that time. And so thank you very much. Thank you.
Nev came to Consilium several times, and he always thought, oh, there's a whole bunch of conservatives out there, you really got to shake them up. So, no, Nev, we're trying, for crying out loud. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, the first person to deliver this address at Consilium in honour of Neville. Bjorn Lomborg is an academic and the author of the best-selling books The Sceptical, Environmentalist and Cool It. He challenges mainstream concerns about the environment and points out that we need to focus attention on the smarter solutions first. And that seems to me to be a pretty good way of thinking about things, doesn't it? He's an adjunct professor at the Copenhagen Business School and director of the Copenhagen Consensus Centre. Now, on your table, there's a sheet about the Copenhagen Consensus Centre and also a copy of the paper which his talk tonight will be based on, so please take it. And the Copenhagen Consensus Centre, which brings together many of the world's top economists, including 7 Nobel laureates, to set priorities for the world. The Copenhagen Consensus Centre is ranked by the University of Pennsylvania as one of the world's top 25 environmental, over-the-page things. I think it probably says think tanks. Think tanks, yes it does. The Economist said Copenhagen Consensus is an outstanding visionary idea and generates global coverage, and I couldn't agree more. Bjorn's a frequent participant in public debates on policy issues. His analysis and commentaries have appeared regularly in such prestigious publications as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Economist, Globe and Mail, that's the Canadian, The Guardian, the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, The Times, the Australian, not the Sydney Morning Herald, I noticed, the Los Angeles Times and Boston Globe. His monthly column appears in around 40 papers in 19 languages with more than 30 million readers. He's a television commentator on such shows, programs on CNN, Fox, MSNBC and so on. He was featured in the movie Cool It by Sundance award-winning director Andy Timoner. In 2011, he was named top 100 Global Thinker by Foreign Policy magazine for looking more right than ever on the politics of climate change. Time magazine ranked Lomborg among the world's 100 most influential people in 2004. In 2008, he was named one of the 50 people who could save the planet by the UK Guardian. There you go. In 2005 and 2008, Foreign Policy and Prospect magazine called him one of the top 100 public intellectuals, and in 2008, Esquire named him one of the world's 75 most influential people of the 21st century. Not bad. Following his address tonight, Bjorn invites you all to join him out in the Consilium Lounge just out there, and he will outline some more work of the Copenhagen Consensus in a fairly informal discussion. I would urge you to grab a glass of wine or whatever else is out there and join him. There's no more rugby, thank God. The work he is doing is of critical importance, and as we try to bring some sense of reality to the debate on climate change and the many other big issues facing the world. Please welcome Bjorn Lomborg to the stage to deliver the inaugural Neville Kennard address. There will be a short Q&A at the end, by the way.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's been a wonderful experience. Thank you very much, Greg, for doing this amazing event. I'm going to be, first of all, I should probably say, if any of you are speed readers, you've already read the article, I have nothing more to add. But for the rest of you, I run the Copenhagen Consensus that I'll be talking about more later on. And we try basically, as Greg just outlined, to think about what are the smartest solutions? How do you get the most bang for your buck? That's what we'll talk about later. And it's very clear that all the people who have the not so great ideas don't like that point. And I speak from experience. A lot of people criticize what we do. We just had a change of the Danish government. They basically they made 15 election promises. They didn't keep 14 of them, but they did keep the 15th, which was to cut off my funding. So you know, there is a lot of emotion in this whole conversation, and I think I'd like to take you back to where that all comes from. So this is really about coming back to 1972, to limits to growth. Limits to growth, I remember, it set a huge amount of a way of thinking into motion. It was not just a small thing. It really told us, listen, we're screwed, and we're screwed big time. I'd like to just read one quote for you from Time magazine. Back in 1972, when they reviewed limits to growth, they wrote, the headline was, "The worst is yet to be." And they said, the furnaces of Pittsburgh are cold. The assembly lines of Detroit are still. That actually turned out to be true. The Los Angeles, a few gaunt survivors of the plague, desperately till freeway center strips, backyards, and outlying fields, hoping to raise a subsistence crop. London's offices are dark. Its docks deserted, and goes on. And then it says, fantastic? No, only grim inevitability if society continues its present dedication to growth and progress. That was how we thought about the world back in 1972. Admittedly, it also had its critics already back then. There was, I love this one piece that actually said, it was headlined, "The Computer That Printed WOLF." Which I thought was, yeah, you have to think about it, right? But it's actually, I thought it was really clever. But really, what it did was it set our way of thinking for a very long time. And why? Well, because it did the catastrophic sense of what's going to happen if we don't take care of the environment in a much better way than we'd done previously. You remember Carson, the woman who essentially started the whole environmental movement in 1962, worrying about the silent spring, the fact that we were essentially polluting our kids and especially our birds. That was why we'd have a silent spring with DDT and other pesticides, and we would essentially pollute ourselves to death. Well, yes, that was very influential, but of course it also gave you hope, because what you had to do was stop polluting. Early in 1968, talked about the population bomb, that we were going to have more and more people and they were just going to crowd out everything on the planet, and made us worry a lot. But of course, he also had this one idea, which meant, well, if we fix that, if we stop having so many kids, we'll be fine. But what they did with the limits to growth, and what was so ingenious and what I think really caught our attention and was the reason why we had so much pessimism in this whole conversation, was that they took these ideas. They said, yes, population, yes, pollution, and then they also looked at what we probably remember most, resources, but then they put them together. And that was the ingenious move. They said, what will happen? Well, we're going to run out of resources. There's only this much left over. If you keep using it, it'll go dry, and then we will be screwed. But then they said, yeah, but what if we're really, really smart and we find more resources? What if we actually find a way out of the resource curse? Well, then we'll just end up being richer and richer. We'll produce more and more, and we'll pollute more and more, and so we'll all die. So, no, there's no way out just because you find the way out of the resources. But then, what if people say, well, what if we also found a way out of the pollution part? And they say, yeah. But what will then happen is we have lots of resources, we don't pollute, but then we'll just keep multiplying, and then we'll be so many people that we can't feed ourselves, and so we'll all die. And the surprising solution was that no matter what we did, we would all die. And we were all screwed. And I think that was really the sense that we were left with in many different ways, that pollution, resources, and population together gave this sense of there's limits to growth. And that was why we started having this conversation that I think in many ways is still with us, why we need to cut back, reduce, do less, and essentially learn to live and not have so much wants of all the different kinds. Let me take you through some of these issues, because I think they're important to look at and get a sense of, well, how did it hold up 40 years later? Resources are probably the thing we remember the best. We all remember how they were very clearly proven right, because we had the oil crisis right after. Of course, that had nothing to do with us running out of oil, but it has everything to do with a monopoly or a growing oligopoly that actually managed to reduce availability of oil. But it gave us the sense that, wow, they were really spot on. What did they actually tell us? Well, they did go through 19 different resources, and they told us that by 2012, we would have run out of 12 of them, including aluminum, copper, gold, tin, tungsten, zinc, and a lot of other in between, of course, also oil and natural gas. It's perhaps worth just pointing out that didn't happen. But perhaps more crucially, why didn't it happen? Well, if you think about it, it's a very, very obvious argument that, if you have this pool of resources, when you've used it up, you're done for, you're screwed, right? It's a very, very simple idea, and it's a very easy idea to get everybody to believe. But there's something fundamentally wrong with that argument. What is that? It is that it forgets innovation. It forgets that we don't just use this one resource. We actually find more resources. We know how to use them better, and of course, sometimes we also substitute away from these resources. So in some ways, as the late economist Julian Simon liked to point out, it's a little bit like saying, when people say there's only this resource and when you've used it, you're screwed. That's a little bit like going back to my place and looking in my fridge and saying, wow, you only have food for 2 days, so you're going to die in 3. No, I'm going to go down and shop, right? And that's, of course, what the world did. Actually, if you look at the resources that we have available, we have used up a lot of those resources, yes, but there are more and more resources available. And the organizers told me, no, you can't use PowerPoint. I'm a statistician. I think graphs are beautiful. So I'm actually going to ask you to just take a look at the graphs. I'm going to circumvent that by having you look at there's actually some really good graphs. If you look at page 33 and in the paper there, you can see the cost of resources from 1850 and to today. And I think it's very instructive. Every economist would say, if things are getting more scarce, prices go up. But if things are getting more abundant, prices go down. And if you look at that graph, it's really, really hard to say things have gotten more scarce. Resources in general have gotten less scarce, more abundant. And even if you look at, we've gone from 5 or 6 times what the cheapest cost in 2001 was in 1850. But even if you look at the dramatic increase that everybody talks about from 2001 until today, it's still just, yes, it is a 100% increase, but on a very low base. It's very hard to get worried about the fact that the world should be running out of stuff. And it's worth pondering a little bit about, because if you think about it, back in the times of old, back in 1850, stuff was really expensive. I don't know, this is one of my favorite little metaphors. Napoleon III, when he was showing off the wealth of France, he was showing off the crown jewels and bars of aluminum. Actually, the most honored guests would eat with aluminum forks and knives, whereas the others would just have to make do with gold utensils. It was only later we realized, oh, wait, it's actually really cheap to make aluminum. And that, of course, means that our kids and grandkids have much better access to aluminum. Actually, if you look back in 1910, the Carnegie, the guy who Carnegie Hall from the US, worried about the idea that we were going to use up all the easily accessible iron. And obviously, iron being a big issue in defending your state, that was a big issue. He said, we're going to use up all the easily accessible iron ore, and we're just going to leave all the crap iron ore to our predecessors, us. And that was exactly true. They used up all the easy accessible iron ore. But what he forgot was he also left us with technology. So yes, we dig deeper today, and we get poorer iron ore, but we get it cheaper. He forgot innovation. And I think that's the bottom line, in much of the first part of what Limits to Growth was all about, we forget innovation is the crucial part of actually tackling human problems. So fundamentally, things have gotten better, not worse. And if you just look at one more graph, if you will, on the next page, you can actually see how much more resources we have today compared to 1970. Everyone would have sort of expected we'll have fewer resources because we've used up a lot of this stuff and that we are also using more and more. But no, because of technology, we've actually found, if you look, for instance, in zinc and copper, we probably 5-doubled the reserves of copper and zinc over the last 40 years because ingenuity has made it possible for us to outdo our rapaciousness. And that's an important point to make. It's not intuitive. It just happens to be true, and that's not unimportant. Likewise, when you talk about pollution, they told us we would cover ourselves and get more and more polluted. But actually, if you look at it, has that happened? Well, it turns out, what is the most polluting stuff that happens? Well, that's poverty. If you're poor, you're polluted, not if you're rich. The most important pollution part is actually indoor air pollution. It was in 1900, it still is today. Most of you probably think, what is indoor air pollution? And that's exactly my point. We don't burn indoor fires anymore to cook or keep warm, but 3.5 billion people still do in this world. And that gives them much, much higher pollution than anything you see in outdoor, even mega metropolises in third world cities. I mean, in most countries in the world, you go outdoor into a big city to get fresh air, right? And so the point here is to, again, remember, yes, pollution was a huge problem, but we've actually fixed a lot of it, and wealth is a large part of it. So again, if you'll just take a look at the last figure I'm going to bother you with, if you look at the first part of that figure, figure 4, you see what everybody thought, namely air pollution pollution was nothing in the early part of last century, and then it would just increase, and only once we all died, it essentially stopped. But in reality, the numbers are entirely different. It was incredibly dangerous to live in 1900. Pollution was a big part of your life. Today, not nearly as much. And of course, in 2050, it's likely to be even less. So again, it's important to get a sense of proportion of what happens on these issues. It was not such that we were running out of resources. It was not such that we were going to pollute ourselves to death. And actually, if you look at population, no, we're not overpopulating the world. If anything, we've seen a dramatic decline in average population growth. If you look at what the demographers a little unlovingly call the average output of a woman, it used to be in the developing world about 6 kids for every woman in 1950. Today, it's down below 3. Now, it still needs to get down further, but it does happen. Why? Because you get rich. When you're poor, yes, it's great to have a lot of kids to help around. They're pretty free and they do a lot of work. But once you get rich, as I'm sure a lot of you have realized, they are not free. They're actually really, really costly. And you start saying, maybe I'll just have 2. So again, the whole point here is to say the 3 things they talked about, resources, pollution, population, was not right. Now, maybe that's interesting, maybe that's a nice little metaphor, but who cares 40 years on? Well, I think we should care for a very simple reason, because much of the intuition that was laid down from Limits to Growth is still with us. In many ways, what drives most of what we think about when we think about, for instance, environment, comes from Limits to Growth. Take a look at what do most people think about when they think about doing something for the environment. If you ask most people, it turns out that they'll say, I recycle. It's what makes you feel like you're a really virtuous person, right? What do you normally recycle? You recycle paper and glass. And why? Well, typically people will say, because I want to save a tree. Really? Were we worried that trees were dying, were going out of business? I mean, most paper, of course, actually comes from well-managed forests. Actually, if you stop using those forests and if you start recycling paper instead, the price of forests go down, and then they will very likely be converted into agriculture instead. So if you want to save trees, no, you should actually buy more paper. If anything, you should certainly not do so because you think it's a great idea to save the resources. We're not running out of trees. And likewise, of course, seriously, glass? Are we running out of sand? Right? Again, the point here is to recognize what is it that makes us do these things. Well, it's the idea that we're running out of all kinds of stuff. That's the motivation for much of what we do, but it doesn't work that way. That's not what the numbers say. And likewise, if you take a look at pollution, and if you take a look at population, I'll just leave that aside because I've been asked I should try to keep my comments as short as possible. Let me just take a look at pollution. Pollution is something that we all worry about. It was a big issue, for instance, right after the first Earth Day, just in the 70s, we had rivers catch fire. It was great we did something about that. But if you look at what was actually mostly the agenda of most environmental agencies, certainly the EPA in the US, it was pollution from DDT and other pesticides. It was the concern of pesticides that Rachel Carson had brought forth, and which was also one of the things that the Limits to Growth guys had been focusing on. But let's just remember, what is the modern day equivalent of that? That's the idea of going organic. It's a great thing if you're rich and if you live in a first world country. It might make you feel really good. But remember, first of all, we actually get about 1/3 of our fertilizer from artificial sources, or to put it differently, if you wanted to have an all organic society, we'd have to find 2 billion volunteers to not be here, as Borlaug liked to point out. And I don't see 2 billion volunteers. But perhaps more importantly, more people worry about getting pesticides because they'll give you cancer. And that's true. Pesticides are actually cancerous. But there's an important environmental and economic point to make here. Remember that, yes, well-regulated cancers will probably cause on the order of about 20 cancer deaths in the US every year. So that's an important number to remember. But let's remember, if we went organic in the US, models estimate that the average cost would be about $100 billion plus a year, basically because you'd have to put in much more resources because organic farming is less efficient. You'd also have to use a lot more area because, again, it's inefficient or less efficient than industrial farming. So you'd actually have to take in, by the reasonably best estimates, you'd probably have to take in an agricultural area this size about California. Where would that come from? Extra nature. And then, of course, it would also mean higher food prices, which, of course, essentially would mean that people would shift away from fruits and vegetables because they would be very expensive. Now, that's crucial because fruits and vegetables is one of the best ways to avoid cancers. So the models, again, estimate that you would probably see about 26,000 extra cancer deaths. And so I would argue that in order to avoid 20 cancer deaths, to pay up with $100 billion to destroy nature the size of California and get an extra 26,000 cancer deaths is not necessarily a good outcome. That's the kind of conversation that we need to restart to have. So I think, honestly, what Limits to Growth has shown us is not only that it was wrong, and that's an important part, to point out, no, ingenuity actually solves a lot of these problems. We can fix resources, we can fix population, we can fix pollution. But also that the remnants of what we do, we pay tribute to this pagan god of delivering used newspapers into recycling booths, or that we say we need to go organic, is not the right way forward. What is the right way forward? Well, it is, again, to focus on what really works, what really matters. And that's still old, boring problems. If you care about pollution, you should care about air pollution. Air pollution still kills 3 million people each year. Not from exciting, exotic causes like global warming or like pesticides, but by simple things that people can't afford good fuels, that they still burn dung and other stuff in their apartments. And of course, the solution to that is not to environmentally start certifying the dung. it's to make them rich. And so if you go back and say, what is the real thing we need to make sure happens in this world, if we want to make people well off, if we want to make a better world, that is to recognize that what really pollutes is poverty. So if we want to get back to doing good in this world, not just feeling good about ourselves, I think it might be worth thinking about scrapping this limits to growth thing and actually realize and embrace, for a better, lack of a better word, that growth is good. Thank you.